Good morning, everyone. While everybody's coming in, thank you very much for being here. This is a very, very, very important conversation for us to have with Andrew Basevich. Our speaker, our conversation partner today is one of my favorite writers. If I see his name on anything, I download it. If I can't read it right then, I think I own all of his books. In my book, 8 Habits of Love, he is one of the starring characters along with Huckleberry Finn in the chapter on truth because of an epiphany he had, which I'm going to ask him to describe. He is a graduate of West Point, a high-ranking man of the Army for 23 years, served in Vietnam. He's Roman Catholic. He, at one point, I think he would still continue to say that he is by nature a conservative, both politically and theologically. And it's always wonderful to have someone of that kind of orientation and posture in life to bring his amazingly brilliant thinking to the concerns of our lives. As we continue with our gospel agenda of peacemaking and nonviolence, it is so important and powerful to have someone of his caliber and giftedness to bring his analytical powers to bear on looking at our life together in this world. We have copies of 2 of his books for sale today. His most recent book, about which he and I will be speaking, Breach of Trust, and also the book before that, The Limits of Power. But I would frankly recommend that you go to your independent bookstore first, and then if they don't have it, one of the online booksellers, and just get absolutely everything that Andrew Basevich has written, because you will not be disappointed, you will be shaken and stirred, and you will not be the same afterwards. So we're going to bring him up. I'm going to make sure that he's with us. He's in his office at his home in Boston, where he's a professor, and we're going to bring him up, and then I'll, at that point, invite you to welcome him. Let's see if he's here. Ah, yes, hello.
Hello.
Good to see you.
Thank you for that kind introduction.
Well, you're very, very welcome. I never engage in hyperbole. I'm a very objective introducer, and I meant everything I said. It was totally objective. And now that you're here and we can hear you, I want you to receive our warm welcome for being with us again. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So, Professor, thanks again for this, and thanks for being with us an earlier Skype interview. We have that, as we will have this in our archives for people to go and download. And we have streamers who are with us, so we'll have to do everything by microphone here in terms of the questions. So that my brothers and sisters in this parish who are gathered here this morning can have a little deeper understanding of who you are and what makes you tick currently. Could you just go back to that evening in Berlin when you and your family were visiting
Sure.
there after the fall of the wall, and tell us what happened and then what it meant to you?
Well, this is more than 20 years ago now. I was at that time a serving officer, and we were in our second Germany tour. I should note that I was born in 1947, really the year that the Cold War began, and I think as I grew up, the Cold War was the defining reality. The Cold War shaped my understanding of what contemporary history was all about, shaped and probably distorted. So this is in early 1990, shortly after the wall had gone down. we had never visited Berlin. We'd been stationed over in West Germany, and took a long weekend to do so. And I, in particular, this is wintertime, I in particular wanted to visit the Brandenburg Gate, because if there's any one place on earth that seemed to define contemporary history, it was the Brandenburg Gate. So picture wintertime, rainy, very cold. I'm with my wife and a couple of our kids. They're getting hungry. And I insisted that we walk up to the Brandenburg Gate, but not from the west side going east, but over in the east side going back towards the west. The avenue there is the Unter den Linden. And so we made this trek of a few blocks and came up to the gate itself, which was strikingly illuminated. And what we discovered there was a number of young men huddled there amongst the pillars who were selling military memorabilia, pins, hats, medals, a wristwatch. I actually bought a wristwatch. And it took me a while to figure out who these people were. All the stuff that they were selling was from the Soviet army. And the young men themselves were obviously off-duty Soviet soldiers trying to make a little bit of extra money. And what was especially striking to me, having for so many years been told that the Soviet military was technologically advanced and exceedingly powerful, what struck me so much was the quality of the items that were for sale. I mean, to put it simply, it was all cheap junk. And I was taken aback by that. I can't say that the scales dropped from my eyes at that particular moment, but it was one of those experiences that stuck with me and began to encourage me to rethink that understanding of contemporary history that had placed the Cold War itself in such a central position. And what I mean by that is this actual face-to-face encounter with the other, the enemy, the foe, they had come across as less than entirely impressive. And I began to wonder if my understanding of what history had been about during my lifetime perhaps was distorted, incomplete, and that therefore here I was basically in my early 40s. Maybe it was time to begin asking questions about things that I had always simply accepted as true. So not a moment that changed everything, but for me personally, a moment that began to change things of great consequence and have brought me to a different view of the Cold War, a different view of what contemporary history is all about, a different view of what America's role in the world has been about. So that's the story.
Thanks for sharing it. And I want to go back to the story itself and ask you a couple of questions. But we are in the wake of Nelson Mandela's death and all of the funeral proceedings, and a rehearsal in every medium about how he was viewed by the United States at one point and labeled a terrorist. And is it right to say that we were viewing him through the Cold War lens that you're referring to, and that everything had to...
And I would point to my...
Yeah, go ahead.
I think there's no question about it. And I would point to myself. When Mandela was still in prison, but his cause had been taken up by, I mean, just to put it broadly, people on the left outside of South Africa. I mean, I myself at the time was not particularly sympathetic because I bought into the notion that we needed to see Mandela in a Cold War context. And in that regard, he espoused views that weren't necessarily sympathetic to the orthodox view coming out of Washington. In a sense, more than that, his cause suggested the inadequacy of seeing the world through the lens of the Cold War. His cause basically undercut the claim that this competition for power between East and West, between the United States and the Soviet Union, was the overarching reality of our time. So, you know, I can single myself out as somebody who didn't have sufficient moral sensitivity to appreciate his significance at that time.
That orthodoxy robbing us of moral sensitivity. Can we just stay with that? I'm going to get to your book, but I am so intrigued by how accepting orthodoxy uncritically as a received narrative that just may be wrong and in fact toxic can keep us from seeing the truth. Just go back to that one more time, my friend.
Well, I mean, you know, I think I would make the same point in the present moment. I mean, we are now living in a time when, certainly for the students that I teach at Boston University, the Cold War is a distant reality of negligible relevance to them. But they have grown up in a time when there is a new orthodoxy, if not new, an orthodoxy that has become particularly acute or powerful in our time. And it's an orthodoxy of consumption. It's an orthodoxy of materialism. It's an orthodoxy that somehow is rooted to the notion that in magical little electronic devices that we can carry in our hands, that in that connected electronic world lies some solution to the world's problems, and that orthodoxy, to my mind, is just as powerful and is just as pernicious as the orthodoxy that I was imbued with when I was basically their age. It's very difficult. Maybe it's difficult in any society at any time, but I think it has become particularly difficult in America in the 20th and 21st century to think independently, to be able to look critically at the orthodoxy of the day. And it's not necessarily, I'm not trying to say that orthodoxy is always wrong in all respects, but I would argue that claims made for the advocates of orthodoxy that they have the answer, that here lies truth, that is always misleading and needs to be challenged.
Thank you. You may not be hearing them, Andrew, but there are amens going on throughout this congregation here behind you, and I think that that statement you've just stated so eloquently really sums up our own feeling here at All Saints Church about both theological orthodoxy and political orthodoxy and the orthodoxy of all policy matters. But let's go ahead.
Can I interrupt there for a second?
Please.
See, this again, as you mentioned, I'm a Catholic, and this is one of the things that makes our new Pope such an interesting figure. Now, I do think, and I'm not a theologian, but I do think as a Catholic, to some degree, the mainstream media is misinterpreting the Pope or overstating the disconnect between what this Pope says and what his two immediate predecessors were saying. That said, this is a guy who is bearing witness in such a powerful way that he personally, I think, invites us to confront the orthodoxy of the day in an exceedingly compelling way. Now, what impact that's going to have on my church, I think, really remains to be seen. But for Catholics, this is a very, very interesting time.
Yeah, I really agree with you. We have a lot of former Catholics and current Catholics who are here in this room, and I remember stating something about the latest, his "I Have a Dream" speech, and how powerful it was, and so many ripples went through the congregation here, and we're hoping that what you're saying is really, really true, that despite a lot of symmetry with what's gone on in the past with his predecessors, nevertheless, there are some sounds from the bell of a change. So let's move to breach of trust, because let's place that in the framework of our current orthodoxy, because you start with a rather compelling and indicting, and for me, call to action in terms of looking at what our current orthodoxy is in terms of civic religion. So if you could spell that out before we go on to what happens with soldiers and what our resolution is going to be. Well,
this is a book about a subject that most people, on hearing me utter the phrase, are going to start to doze off. It's a book about civil-military relations. Now, there are two ways to think about civil-military relations. I think the more common way is to think about the relationship between senior political leaders and senior military officers. You know, the question of how President Obama, for example, interacts with the 3- and 4-star officers that run the military. That's one version of civil-military relations. This book is about the other version. And the other version, really, the civil-military relations that I refer to, is the relationship between the American people and the American military, between us and soldiers. When I was a young officer in Vietnam, toward the end of the Vietnam War, the American military, and particularly the Army in which I served, was in bad shape. It was in bad shape for all kinds of reasons. But the root cause was that the Army had gotten itself bogged down in an unwinnable war that was, in fact, an unnecessary war, and that had divided the country as a consequence. One of the principal manifestations of the was an erosion of order and discipline. And I begin the book by recounting a very specific episode that happened in my unit, the unit that I was serving. And the episode was one in which a young black soldier murdered his company commander in broad daylight, shot him. And I cited that partly because it affected me deeply. It was something I could never forget. And also because I think it exemplified the problem. What was the solution to the problem? Well, of course, one solution to the problem was end the Vietnam War and try to avoid any other wars like that. But organizationally, the solution to the problem that we, the people, I think, not simply agreed to, but insisted upon. The solution to the problem was to end the draft, to create what we have called, I think inappropriately, the all-volunteer force. Now, in terms of people making decisions, we all know that it was Richard Nixon who ended the draft. My argument in part is that actually Nixon was simply ratifying a decision that we collectively had already made. We had rendered the draft unenforceable. Well, as a young officer, I must tell you, back in the 1970s and into the 1980s, I thought this is a pretty good move. We now had a military consisting of people who wanted to serve. People who want to serve tend to probably be more amenable to discipline, more amenable to a difficult, challenging training regimen. There, by any measure you can think of, the quality of the United States military in the 80s and through the 90s improved. What I didn't appreciate, and only have come to appreciate in retrospect, is that by abandoning the draft and creating the all-volunteer force, in effect what the country was doing was jettisoning the tradition of the citizen soldier that not only went back to the first days of the Republic, but actually went back to the colonial era. A tradition that said that in a republic, the people should be the first line of defense. That, in fact, was the tradition that pertained up to and including the Vietnam War. It was citizen soldiers who fought to save the Union in 1861 and 1865. It was citizen soldiers of my parents' generation who fought and won World War II. What has become clear to me in the wake of 9/11, in particular, are the costs of abandoning the citizen soldier tradition. And the costs, I think, are quite heavy and quite terrible. First cost, of course, and others have commented on this, is that basically the Army went from being America's Army to being Washington's Army. We forfeited any significant say in how that Army would be used. Certainly, that was the attitude of George W. Bush and the people around him, the people who the 9/11 military. In addition, what we found is the military no longer could be sized in order to address the threat. And I probably should be using the word threat there in parentheses or in quotes. So that, for example, when Bush decided to invade Iraq, obviously a stupid, ill-advised move, he lacked the ability to expand the force in order to meet the mission. And so we ended up with a war that dragged on forever. And we also ended up with a war in which, given that there was too much war and too few warriors, the solution was to hire contractors, mercenaries. We ended up with more contractors in Iraq and more contractors in Afghanistan than we ever ended up with, than there were soldiers. And finally, I say this as somebody who is neither a warmonger nor, in particular, somebody who is in the peace movement. But we didn't even win the wars. They just dragged on and on and on. Back when we relied on citizen soldiers, we tended to win. So I've come to view the creation of the all-volunteer force as a catastrophic mistake that has given rise to reckless, arrogant military policies that plunge us in wars that cost tremendously, whether you're talking blood costs, costs in treasure, or moral costs, and that do not yield positive outcomes. So the book basically is an argument that says maybe it's time for us to examine critically this all-volunteer force, in effect, this professional military that we have had for the past 40 years or so, and to consider whether or not it is not in the interests of this country to revise the tradition of the citizen soldier. Now, let me say one more thing before we get to questions or other comments, and that is, as soon as I said what I just said, people say, aha, you must be in favor of the draft. To which I say, well, no, not necessarily. That in fact, what I do favor, at least having a conversation about, creating a program of national service. And I think many of you know what that means. Means that basically all 18-year-olds owe a term of service to community and country, some of them fulfilling that obligation by serving in the military, the remainder, and frankly the majority, fulfilling that obligation in a variety of other ways. But everybody serves. What does that do for us? Well, arguably, it reconnects the military society to society, gives us a military more representative of society, causes us, parents of these soldiers, to pay closer attention when they're being sent in harm's way, and more broadly, perhaps, serves to enrich the reigning conception of citizenship, which to my mind has been basically reduced to the notion of, I get rights and I have no obligations. And I don't think that that conception of citizenship is particularly healthy for our democracy.
Amen, amen, amen. Just one more line of questioning, and then we'll open it up to everybody's questions. So I don't know if we have a snowball's chance in hell of adopting your intervention or solution. And at the same time I say that, I'm reading more and more in a conversation with a parishioner who had just served 2 years working for one of President Obama's cabinet officers. He said, while I was reading the same phenomenon, that with the impasse that we now have, which seems so immature and infantile in Washington and Congress, that President Obama has come to terms with the fact that he is going to have to use more and more of his executive authority to do what many people in this room, I think, would call sane policies. And I'd love for you to comment on that as it pertains to in any way, anything that comes to your mind, Andrew, but particularly with foreign policy. And is your critique, which I understand is shared by others, not enough, is it impacting President Obama or the entire White House system, their attitude to Syria and to Iran, in terms of saying, war is not the answer, particularly the way we've been doing war lately?
Right. Good question. Let me just go back a little bit to the specific notion of, is it possible to revive the tradition of the citizen soldier, and connect it to the point you correctly made, that this second-term president facing trying to deal with a dysfunctional Congress finds himself forced to rely on the use of executive authority to get anything done. If I could have 2 minutes of the president's time on his basic military policy, what I would urge him to do, and he could do, would be to create a national commission to study this question of national service, or to evaluate whether or not the professional military that we created 40 years ago actually serves the country's interests. To do that basically as a vehicle for educating the American people, to put the question of basic military policy on the agenda. No, I don't think there's a snowball's chance in hell of anything happening in the near term. But I'm also reminded of the fact that healthcare reform, as much as President Obama gets either the credit or the blame, depending on how you look at it, healthcare reform came about as a consequence of 2 or 3 decades worth of efforts by people who believed in it to promote the idea. And indeed, the late senator from my state, Senator Kennedy, in many respects was the guy who carried that torch for a long, long time. And I think that with regard to basic military policy, we need some figure like Kennedy who's going to carry that torch and over a period of time promote changes in thinking that could actually lead to changes in policy. Now, where is the president on foreign policy? I think there's no question. And the Syria case is a very good example that the White House is aware of the fact that not simply that U.S. military policy since 9/11 has failed, as indeed it has, particularly in Iraq and Afghanistan, but that failure now is compromising the freedom of action of the commander-in-chief. He intended to attack Syria. There's no question about that. And he backed away from that because the polls said the American people didn't want another war. Congress was clearly signaling it didn't want another war. And then it's almost humorous, but I do think that the decisive action was the vote by the British Parliament, when the British Parliament said that the Brits even wouldn't go with us on this one. And so the president backed away from what would have been another major campaign in what we used to call, inappropriately, the global war on terrorism. But that doesn't mean that the president somehow has reversed course in a broader sense, because what this president has mostly done is to recognize that invading and occupying countries is a bad idea, and to then seek for alternative means to continue the war that in many respects his predecessor launched after 9/11. And the president's favored means are drone strikes and special operations forces. And even since pulling back from the brink in Syria, we've continued to have this reliance on drone strikes in particular as a way to continue the war. And I think that, set aside the moral questions if you want to, and just focus on the questions of effectiveness, military effectiveness. What's militarily effective is what enables you to achieve your political purposes at a reasonable cost. And what the reliance on drones has done is, in a sense, it reduces the cost. It's cheaper than invading and occupying countries, but it's not politically effective. I mean, we're not going to, whatever it means to win the war on terrorism, we're not going to win by relying on drone strikes. Matter of fact, you can make a pretty strong argument that for every 6 or 10 or 15 bona fide terrorists we kill, we're probably creating another 1,500 Muslims in that part of the world who think ill of us. Think ill of us because sometimes we're killing innocent people. Think ill of us because of our arrogance in imagining that we can just go ahead and kill people wherever we feel like killing them. I'm glad that the president has learned some things, but it seems to me in a larger sense, he has not been able to confront the illogic of the war on terrorism.
Andrew, that is such a voice of sanity. Thank you, God Almighty. Thank you very much. Okay. So, all right, we've got hands waving, and I'm going to be in trouble with my people if I don't give them a chance to ask you some questions. Here's the first one, and bring a microphone to this Vietnam veteran right here, because I want him to ask a question too. Please go ahead.
Thank you. First, Merry Christmas to you, sir. I'm not familiar with your work, but I'm sure I will be soon.
Yes, sir, you will be after the day.
I, like you, am a product of the Cold War, hiding under the desks and little trip to Southeast Asia, What are your thoughts concerning China presently? Aggravation between China, Japan. They've got a new aircraft carrier. Airspace is being challenged over islands that nobody lives on. But U.S. involvement in that, could you speak to that a little bit?
Well, I'm not a China expert. I visited China exactly one time. I was overwhelmed by the evidence of very rapid change on a staggering scale. And I think I came away with two impressions. The first is that there's no question that, to my mind, that in the 21st century, China will be, indeed already is, a bona fide great power. We must reckon with that fact. We cannot wish it away. The second thing, and this was in conversations that I had with this little group I was with, conversations with government leaders, party leaders, people in think tanks, universities. They are exceedingly sophisticated and serious, both in acknowledging the magnitude of the challenges that they face and in being able to conceptualize plausible solutions. Plausible solutions. You know, they will tell you, we have the worst environmental problems on the planet. And they will say, here's how we're going to try to get our arms around these problems. We have a plan. And then they will say, and we can't tell you for sure it's going to work. All we can tell you is we're going to work hard at it. So the candor, the seriousness, very striking. So geopolitically, we're going to have to reckon with China. And that may well be, well, I would say that the biggest challenge we face in the 21st century in terms of matters of war and peace, the big challenge is recognizing that there is in fact already a multipolar order. The notions that were very popular in the immediate wake of the Cold War, that the United States was the sole superpower, that it was a unipolar international order, that we were the indispensable nation. That was hogwash then, it's even more hogwash now. So our children, our grandchildren, we're going to live in a time when the United States is going to continue to be a very powerful country, probably the most powerful in the world, but we're not going to be able to simply call the shots. We have to figure out how to create an order that's going to accommodate the interests and concerns of China, of India, of Japan, of Russia, of the EU, maybe of Brazil, Turkey. And if there's going to be some semblance of, if we can avoid the catastrophes of the 20th century, 2 world wars and a Cold War, if we can avoid those catastrophes, it will be because we are able to put together some sort of arrangement whereby this collection of very powerful nations are going to be able to tolerate one another. Not necessarily live in peace and harmony and brotherly love, but to avoid conflict. If we can get that done, we will have, or our children will have, achieved a lot. And I think the place to begin from an American perspective is to acknowledge the limits of our power, the limits of our wisdom. Not that that's going to make everything hunky-dory, but at least we'll be able to see past some of the arrogance that has characterized American policy over the past 25 years or so.
Wonderful. I think this will have to be our last question.
Andrew, my name is Toby Pugh, and on behalf of All Saints Church, thank you for your service and welcome home. Welcome home to All Saints as a veteran. We are open and loving of veterans, and we mourn the loss of your son with you. I have long been an advocate of universal service in our country. Israel does it very effectively. James Fallows makes a very interesting argument on behalf of this, who's saying people who are in leadership positions can really only understand the military by having served in the military, can only understand war by having been in war. And he advocates, although he did not serve, he advocates universal service by people who are in leadership positions as people are growing up, and advances that to both genders, so that men and women who are going to be coming into leadership positions have some experience of the responsibilities that go along with the rights. Can you speak to that or have any thoughts on that? Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I probably would not go as far as Jim Fallows goes, but he's not wrong. I mean, I wouldn't go that far because, you know, Franklin Roosevelt never served in the military, and he did okay as commander-in-chief. Abraham Lincoln barely had any military service. He did okay as commander-in-chief. So it's not like it needs to be a prerequisite. But I would say that what we need to have is elite institutions, government, universities, media, the corporate world, the high-tech world. It would be, I think, tremendously useful to have the leadership, the elite level of leadership, at least be seeded with a certain number of veterans and people who have some personal appreciation of what war is all about. And I think there are ways to do that. Again, the concept of nationals, the military we have today, which has many virtues, is not representative of American society. You know, there just aren't that many kids who will be graduating from Harvard this coming spring who are going to go join the United States Army. But a program of national service that requires everybody to serve in some capacity, some to serve in the military, would, I think, close the gap between the military and society and ensure that 20 years from now, 30 years from now, when the new elite appears, again, in whatever walk of life, we'd be more likely to have an elite that did have that appreciation of what war and military service are all about. And it would guarantee nothing, but I think probably would help to give us a bit less recklessness and a bit more wisdom in terms of how we use our power.
Andrew, we've got a lot of questions that we didn't get to. I'm going to ask all of you to send your questions to me, and I will forward them on to Andrew, but I have to go to church now. And in order to do that, Andrew, I just want to say thank you very much again. As a Catholic, you know that we're on the journey to Christmas through Advent, and as we prepare to celebrate the birth of the Prince of Peace, here's someone who's talking such sanity about war and militarism and peace. You have really enriched our Advent. The invitation stands open, my brother, for you to come here and let us warmly welcome you. And I've been jealous of those sips of coffee you've been having during this interview. I'll come to Boston and have a cup of coffee with you. But now we're going to say farewell and sell some books. Thank you again.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.